The 7 biblical mysteries that made an atheist believe in God. God's most dangerous enemy changed his mind, not because he got old, not because he got scared, not because someone preached at him. Antony Flew, the philosopher who spent 50 years building the most rigorous intellectual case against the existence of God, looked at the DNA inside a single human cell, looked at the physics of the universe, looked at what happened 3 days after a crucifixion in Jerusalem, and concluded that everything he had built was wrong. He called it following the evidence. What the evidence led him to, 7 biblical mysteries that he could not explain away, is what we are about to examine. And by the end, the question will not be whether Flew was right to change his mind. The question will be why it took him 50 years. Antony Gerard Newton Flew was born in 1923 in London, the son of a Methodist minister. You would think that background might have made belief easier. Instead, it seemed to sharpen his appetite for honest interrogation. By the time he was a teenager, the questions were already forming. By the time he reached Oxford after the Second World War, he had become something that would define his professional life for the next half-century. A committed, principled, philosophically sophisticated atheist. At Oxford, he encountered some of the great minds of the century. He knew the arguments of C.S. Lewis personally, attending Lewis's famous Socratic Club, where theists and atheists debated with real intellectual force. He was shaped by the tradition of Bertrand Russell, whose rigorous empiricism and rejection of metaphysical comfort had made atheism a respectable intellectual position. Flew absorbed all of it and went further. In 1950, he published his landmark essay, Theology and Falsification, which became one of the most widely reprinted philosophical papers of the 20th century. Its central argument was elegant and devastating. If no conceivable evidence could ever count against a belief, then that belief carries no real content. It is, in Flew's term, a death by 1,000 qualifications. God exists, but when disaster strikes, the believer says God works in mysterious ways. God is love, but when suffering appears, the believer adjusts. Flew's point was that a position that can never be falsified is not a position at all. It is a verbal habit masquerading as a claim. This was the philosophical tradition he worked within for decades. Not mere disbelief, but a rigorous demand that any claim about reality must be open to being wrong. He applied it to religion, with precision and without apology. He debated Gary Habermas in 1985 in Dallas in front of 3,000 people. A panel of 10 judges evaluated the exchange, and 7 gave the debate to Habermas. Flew registered the result but did not change his position. He had been debating Christians his whole life. A loss on points did not constitute evidence. He kept going. He had a principle he returned to throughout his career, something Socratic in its simplicity. Follow the evidence wherever it leads. He had said it publicly. He had taught it to students. He believed it completely. The problem, which would only become apparent much later, was that he had not yet finished following it. The first mystery has no theology in it at all, no scripture, no prophecy, no church. It is, in the most austere sense, a question of chemistry and information theory, and it is the one that Flew himself identified as the primary driver of his change. The question is this: how does dead matter create coded information? You are made of roughly 37 trillion cells. Inside nearly every one of them sits a nucleus, and inside that nucleus is a molecule called deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. It is a long, coiled, double-stranded chain of chemical units called nucleotides, arranged in sequences that carry instructions for building every protein your body requires. The human genome contains approximately 3 billion base pairs. If you were to uncoil the DNA from a single human cell and stretch it out, it would extend to roughly 2 meters in length. If you stretched out all the DNA in all the cells in your body end to end, it would reach from Earth to Pluto and back, multiple times. This is extraordinary in itself. But the extraordinary part is not the length. The extraordinary part is the information. In 1953, Francis Crick and James Watson discovered the double helix structure of DNA, one of the most celebrated moments in the history of science. What emerged from subsequent decades of research was something Crick himself found philosophically staggering. DNA functions as a language. The sequence of its nucleotide bases encodes specific instructions, like letters in an alphabet that, when read in the right order, produce specific proteins. Remove a letter, scramble the sequence. The protein fails to form, and the organism fails to live. The information is not merely complex. It is specified. It is functional. It behaves in every meaningful sense like code written by an intelligence. This is what Flew confronted. Not the existence of life, which had long been debated in evolutionary terms, but the existence of information. In There Is a God, published in 2007, his most important late work, Flew wrote that what the DNA investigations had shown, by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements needed to produce life, is that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinarily diverse elements to work together. The book itself, co-written with Roy Varghese and published by HarperCollins, is where Flew lays out the complete architecture of his reasoning. He was drawing on work by scientists like Gerald Schroeder, whose book The Science of God had impressed him deeply, and who had pointed out the improbable statistics involved in the spontaneous formation of even the simplest, life-sustaining molecule. The skeptic's counter is well known. Evolution by natural selection, operating over billions of years, can produce astonishing complexity without any guiding intelligence. Richard Dawkins, Flew's most famous contemporary atheist adversary, had spent decades making exactly this case. The selfish gene, the blind watchmaker, the river out of Eden, all variations on the same theme, which is that apparent design can emerge from unguided process given sufficient time and sufficient selection pressure. Flew's response was specific and important. He was not disputing evolution. He was asking about something earlier. Evolution requires something to evolve. Natural selection requires something to select from. Before the first self-replicating molecule, before the first cell, before the first organism capable of variation, there is a prior question. Where did the information come from? How did a sequence of chemicals come to carry instructions? The origin of life problem, distinct from the evolution problem, had not been solved by the time Flew reached his 80s. It has not been solved today, and the deeper molecular biology advanced, the harder the problem became. Every new layer of cellular complexity, every new discovered mechanism, every new interlocking system of regulation and repair, made the spontaneous origin of the first working cell appear not more plausible but less. The more science advanced, the harder atheism became to defend. But biology was only the beginning. The universe you live in is extraordinarily improbable. This is not a mystical claim. It is a statement that emerges from physics, from the measurement of what are called the fundamental constants, the basic numerical values that govern how matter and energy behave. The strength of gravity, the mass of the electron, the cosmological constant which describes the energy density of empty space, the ratio of electromagnetic force to gravitational force. Each of these constants has a precise value, and physicists have done the unsettling calculation of asking what would happen if those values were slightly different. The results are dramatic. If the gravitational constant were slightly stronger, stars would burn out too quickly to allow life to develop on their planets. If it were slightly weaker, galaxies would never form. If the cosmological constant, the value that governs the expansion rate of the universe, were fractionally larger, the universe would have expanded so rapidly after the Big Bang that matter would never have clumped together into stars or galaxies at all. If it were fractionally smaller, the universe would have collapsed back on itself long before any chemistry could occur. The range within which life as we know it is possible is extraordinarily narrow. Physicists sometimes describe the universe as fine-tuned, meaning that its basic parameters appear calibrated with astonishing precision for the existence of complex matter and ultimately life. Albert Einstein, who was not a conventional believer, but was not a conventional atheist either, wrote in his autobiographical notes that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. He meant something precise. The fact that the human mind can discover mathematical laws that govern the behavior of the physical universe is not something that follows from any purely materialist picture of how minds evolved. It is a deep and unreasonable adequacy of mathematics to describe nature. Fred Hoyle was an English astronomer who spent most of his career as a committed atheist. He made one of the fundamental contributions to modern astrophysics, working out the process by which stars forge the heavy elements essential to life through nuclear fusion, a process called stellar nucleosynthesis. It was in the course of this work that Hoyle encountered something that genuinely disturbed him. Life depends on carbon. Carbon is produced inside stars when 3 helium nuclei fuse together in a process that works only because of a specific resonance in the carbon nucleus at a very precise energy level, what became known as the Hoyle state, which Hoyle actually predicted before it was confirmed experimentally. The problem was the precision. For carbon to be produced in the quantities necessary for life to exist, and then for oxygen to also be produced in the right quantities, 2 nuclear energy levels had to sit at very specific values. The slightest deviation in either direction would produce a universe with almost no carbon and almost no oxygen, and therefore no biology whatsoever. Hoyle's conclusion, published in the Annual Review of Astronomy and Astrophysics in 1982, was stated with blunt force. A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super-intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. Hoyle did not become a Christian. He retained his skepticism about organized religion until his death in 2001. But his honest encounter with the data pushed him to a conclusion that defied the atheism he had carried his whole life. Physicist Paul Davies, in his book The Mind of God, published in 1992 by Simon & Schuster, made the same observation from a slightly different angle. The universe, he wrote, is not merely lawful in the way a machine is lawful. It exhibits a kind of mathematical elegance, a deep structural beauty, that is not required by the laws themselves but seems to reflect something more fundamental. The deeper you push into the physics, the more it looks like the universe was not merely possible but intentional. This is where things become difficult to explain within a purely materialist framework. A universe governed by blind forces has no reason to be beautiful. It has no reason to be comprehensible. It has no reason to be precisely calibrated for the emergence of life, yet it is all three. And then the mystery became historical. You have probably been told, at some point in your life, that Jesus is a religious figure, and therefore a matter of faith, not history. That is a reasonable starting position, but it is not quite accurate. Jesus of Nazareth, whatever one concludes about his divine nature, is a historical figure attested by sources that have nothing to gain from his existence. Tacitus was a Roman senator and historian, writing around 116 AD, who was explicitly hostile to Christianity, describing it in his Annals, Book 15, Chapter 44, as a deadly superstition. He had no interest in promoting the movement, yet in describing how Emperor Nero used the Christians as scapegoats after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, Tacitus mentions that Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. Scholars across the spectrum of belief and unbelief generally regard this reference as historically authentic. Tacitus was not a friend of Christianity, which makes his testimony more, not less, credible as historical evidence. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian, writing in the late 1st century, an aristocrat who had commanded Jewish forces against Rome before ultimately surrendering and settling in Rome under Nero's patronage. His major work, The Antiquities of the Jews, contains 2 references to Jesus. The first, known as the Testimonium Flavianum in Antiquities 1863-64, is more contested, with most scholars believing it contains a genuine core that was later embellished by Christian scribes. The second, in Antiquities 20:9-1, is widely accepted as authentic, a reference to James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, which is significant precisely because it is incidental, a detail inserted in passing during an account of the execution of James by the high priest Ananus. Josephus scholar Louis Feldman noted that few have doubted the genuineness of this second reference. Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor writing to Emperor Trajan around 112 AD, in a letter seeking legal advice about how to handle Christians in his province, describes their practices in detail. He notes that they met regularly before dawn, sang hymns to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by oath to abstain from fraud, theft, and adultery. He calls their belief a depraved, excessive superstition, which is exactly the kind of language a Roman administrator would use, and not the language of a promoter. His letter is found in his epistles, Book 10, letters 96 and 97. What these three independent sources establish taken together is that by the early 2nd century, a movement had spread from Judea to Rome that traced itself to a figure named Jesus or Christus, that this figure had been executed under Pontius Pilate, and that his followers had continued worshiping him as divine even after his death. These are not theological claims. They are historical observations made by people who viewed the movement with skepticism or contempt. The debate was no longer whether Christianity existed. The deeper question was what could explain its survival. This is the mystery that sits at the emotional center of everything that follows. The movement that would become Christianity began not with a triumph but with a catastrophe. Jesus of Nazareth was arrested, tried, and executed by crucifixion, a form of death specifically designed by the Romans to be maximally humiliating, reserved for slaves and the lowest classes of criminals. It was not simply painful. It was designed to communicate contempt. A crucified man was a man abandoned by the gods, defeated by the empire, finished. In Jewish messianic tradition, a Messiah who died in defeat was not a Messiah. The end of a messianic movement's leader was supposed to be the end of the movement. And yet, within weeks of the crucifixion, the disciples of Jesus were publicly proclaiming that he had risen from the dead, that the tomb was empty, and that he had appeared to them alive. Within decades, this claim had spread across the Roman Empire. Within 3 centuries, it had become the dominant religious tradition of that same empire. Historian N.T. Wright spent over 20 years studying this question and wrote what is now considered the definitive historical treatment of the subject. His book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, published by T&T Clark in 2003 and running to over 800 pages, argues from within the framework of professional academic history, not theology, that the empty tomb and the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus to his disciples are the best historical explanation for the existence and the character of early Christianity. Wright's central argument is not primarily about miracles, it is about mutation. Jewish belief in resurrection was well established by the 1st century, but it had a specific character. It referred to a general resurrection at the end of time, of all the righteous together. No Jewish tradition before Christianity contained the idea of a single individual being raised bodily from the dead in the middle of history, before the general resurrection, and then being worshipped as divine alongside the God of Israel. The Christian mutation of this belief, Wright argues in chapters 12 through 18 of The Resurrection of the Son of God, is so specific and so historically unprecedented that something powerful must have caused it. Gary Habermas, distinguished research professor of philosophy at Liberty University, has spent over 4 decades cataloging scholarly opinion on the historical facts surrounding the resurrection. In his minimal facts approach, which he developed over his career, and articulated most fully in The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, co-written with Michael Licona, and published by Kriegel in 2004, Habermas identifies a set of facts accepted by nearly all New Testament scholars regardless of theological orientation. Jesus died by crucifixion. His disciples believed they saw him alive afterwards. The movement's most ferocious persecutor, Paul of Tarsus, was suddenly converted after what he described as a personal encounter with the risen Jesus. James, the brother of Jesus, who had been a skeptic during Jesus' ministry, became a central leader of the Jerusalem church and was eventually executed for his belief. The tomb in which Jesus was buried was reported empty on the 3rd day after the crucifixion, and his opponents, who had every reason to produce a body if one existed, never did. These are not theological propositions. They are historical claims that can be evaluated by standard historical criteria: early attestation, multiple independent sources, embarrassing admissions, enemy acknowledgement. And they pass those criteria with remarkable consistency. Something happened after the crucifixion, and history still debates what it was. At some point, Antony Flew stopped asking whether religion was emotionally comforting. He had never found it comforting, which was one of the reasons he had never believed it. He had not been searching for consolation. He had been following the evidence, and the evidence, he was beginning to realize, was not cooperating with the conclusions he had held for 50 years. He started asking a different question, not whether atheism was philosophically defensible in the abstract, not whether the arguments against God were internally coherent, but whether atheism could still explain reality. Not whether God was a comfortable idea, but whether the universe, examined honestly, looked like a universe that had no author. The answer that was forming was not the one he had expected. Ancient texts present a particular kind of challenge to the investigative mind. They can be dismissed as legend, myth, or propaganda. They can also, under the right kind of scrutiny, reveal something unexpected, a level of historical specificity and predictive detail that does not fit comfortably within any purely naturalistic account. The book of Isaiah is one of the oldest sustained prophetic texts in the Hebrew Scriptures. Its authorship and dating have been debated by scholars for centuries, and those debates are real and unresolved. What is not in doubt, thanks to one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, is that the text existed before the life of Jesus. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd in the Judean desert near the Dead Sea stumbled upon a series of clay jars hidden in a cave. What he had found would eventually become known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the most important manuscript discoveries in human history. Among the scrolls was a nearly complete copy of the book of Isaiah, now known as the Great Isaiah Scroll, which was dated by paleographic analysis and carbon dating to approximately 150 to 100 BC, more than a century before the birth of Jesus. The scroll is currently housed at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem and is available in high-resolution digital form. Isaiah 53, within that scroll, contains a description of a figure referred to as the servant of the Lord, which has been at the center of the most intense dispute in the entire history of biblical interpretation. The text, which you can read in its original context beginning at verse 1 and continuing through the end of the chapter, describes a figure who is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. It describes a figure who is pierced for the transgressions of others, crushed for their iniquities. It describes a figure whose suffering is vicarious, borne on behalf of others rather than as punishment for his own wrongdoing. It describes a figure who is led like a lamb to the slaughter, silent before his accusers. It describes a figure whose grave was assigned among the wicked, yet who ends up in a rich man's tomb. And it describes a figure who, after the suffering, sees the light of life once more. Christians have read this as a portrait of Jesus, written 7 centuries before his birth. Jewish scholars have argued, with substantial historical justification, that the text refers to the collective suffering of the nation of Israel, or to a historical figure of Isaianic times. The debate is ancient and unresolved. Both sides marshal serious scholarship. Peter Gentry and Stephen Wellham address the contested exegetical questions in depth in their work, Kingdom Through Covenant, published by Crossway in 2012, while the Jewish scholar Benjamin Uffenheimer presents the counter-arguments with equal force in the scholarly literature on Second Temple interpretation. What the Dead Sea Scrolls settlement of the dating question achieved was the elimination of one particularly convenient escape hatch. Before 1947, some scholars could argue that passages like Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22, with its cry of, my God, why have you forsaken me?" with its description of hands and feet pierced and garments divided by lots, were composed after the Christian era and retroactively attributed to ancient prophets. The Great Isaiah Scroll made that argument untenable. The text predated Jesus. What you do with that fact depends on what prior commitments you bring to the table. Coincidence or something deeper? The sixth mystery moves away from history entirely and enters the territory that philosophers call philosophy of mind, the investigation of what consciousness actually is and why it exists at all. You are aware of yourself. You are reading these words, and there is something it is like to be you reading them. You experience the visual sensation of the text, Perhaps the sound of a voice in your head forming the syllables, a sense of understanding or puzzlement or recognition. These experiences, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the felt quality of any mental state are what philosophers call qualia, or phenomenal experience, and they present what Australian philosopher David Chalmers in his landmark 1995 paper and subsequent 1996 book, The Conscious Mind, published by Oxford University Press, called The Hard Problem of Consciousness. The hard problem is not about explaining behavior. Science is quite good at explaining behavior in terms of neural processes. When you pull your hand away from a flame, neuroscience can trace the entire pathway from sensory receptor to motor response with impressive precision. What science cannot explain, and what Chalmers argued cannot in principle be explained by any functional account, is why those neural processes are accompanied by subjective experience at all. Why is there something it is like to be you? Why is the processing of light by your retina not merely computation but experience, the felt quality of seeing? Chalmers's argument is that no amount of physical description of what neurons do, however complete, will logically entail that there is any subjective experience accompanying those processes. You could, in principle, describe all the functional organization of a brain and still leave open the question of whether that brain feels anything from the inside. He called the hypothetical entity that is physically identical to a conscious human, but has no inner experience, a philosophical zombie. And his point was that such an entity is at least conceivable, which means that the physical facts do not necessitate the experiential facts. Consciousness is something over and above the physical. Alvin Plantinga, one of the most influential philosophers of religion of the 20th century, has pressed this point from a different direction in a series of works culminating in Where the Conflict Really Lies, published by Oxford University Press in 2011. Plantinga argues that naturalism, the view that only the physical world exists, is self-undermining when applied to the reliability of rational thought itself. If human minds are the product of purely undirected natural selection operating on random genetic mutation, then the only criterion by which cognitive faculties were selected is survival value, not truth tracking. A belief that enhances survival is not necessarily a true belief. The worry is that a thoroughly naturalistic picture of the mind gives you no good reason to trust the deliverances of that mind, including the deliverances that led you to naturalism in the first place. This is not merely a theological argument. It is a logical observation about the limits of a certain kind of physicalism. And it is one that Flew took seriously. In There Is a God, he noted that his growing openness to the hypothesis of a divine intelligence was connected to his reflection on what kind of universe would be one in which minds capable of reasoning about the universe could exist at all. A universe with consciousness in it is a stranger and more demanding universe than a universe without it. And a universe with consciousness that is reliable, that can actually discover truths about physics and mathematics and history, is stranger still. If the universe is only matter, why can matter think about itself? And why, when it does, can it apparently get it right? Christianity should have disappeared. By any standard calculation of historical probability, the movement that formed around Jesus of Nazareth should have dissolved within a few years of his execution. History is full of messianic movements that collapsed the moment their leader was killed. The execution of a Messiah was not an unusual event in first-century Judea. Rome dealt with prophets and revolutionaries constantly. What was unusual, what has no real parallel in the historical record, was what happened next. Within 300 years of the crucifixion, Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. The same empire that had executed its founder, that had fed its members to lions in the Colosseum under Nero in 64 AD, that had burned them alive to light the imperial gardens, that had under Diocletian in 303 AD issued formal edicts ordering the destruction of Christian churches, the burning of Christian scriptures, and the imprisonment of Christian clergy, had adopted their faith as its state religion. This is, by any measure, one of the more remarkable reversals in the history of human civilization. Tacitus, in the same passage of Annals 1544, where he confirms the execution of Jesus under Pontius Pilate, describes the Christians of Nero's Rome as a class hated for their enormities, their theology dismissed as a deadly superstition. He is not writing about a powerful or respected movement. He is writing about a persecuted minority used as a convenient scapegoat. And yet, the Roman Empire that began its existence as Christianity's most powerful persecutor ended its existence as Christianity's formal patron. Every other religious movement that the Roman state suppressed with comparable ferocity was eventually suppressed successfully. The followers of Spartacus were crucified along the Appian Way. The Jewish revolt of 70 AD was crushed with the destruction of the temple and the dispersal of the Jewish people from their land. Movement after movement, leader after leader, the machinery of Rome ground the opposition into historical silence. Christianity survived not just in one place but everywhere simultaneously. It spread to Egypt, to Syria, to Asia Minor, to Greece, to Rome itself, to North Africa, through a network of communities connected by letter and by trade routes, each supporting the others, each reproducing the central claim, which was not primarily a moral teaching but a historical assertion, that a man executed in Jerusalem had returned from the dead, had been seen by hundreds of witnesses, and that this event had changed everything about the relationship between humanity and God. The historical evidence for the growth of early Christianity across the empire comes not just from Christian sources, which can be legitimately suspected of bias, but from the Roman administrators themselves. Pliny the Younger's letter to Trajan, written around 112 AD and preserved in his Epistles Book 10, describes Christians in his province of Bithynia as having spread to every kind of social level, including the rural areas, and as having grown sufficiently numerous that pagan temples had experienced a notable decline in worshippers. He was not celebrating this. He was alarmed by it, which is precisely why he was writing to the emperor for guidance. The martyrs are a critical part of this picture. Not because dying for a belief proves the belief is true, which it obviously does not, but because it addresses a specific historical question. What kind of people die for a lie they know is a lie? The standard sociological analysis of movements and cults acknowledges that people can die for false beliefs held sincerely. Thousands of people throughout history have died for religious claims that were almost certainly false. But the specific question raised by the resurrection, and raised with particular force by Habermas in the case for the resurrection of Jesus, is what motivated the original disciples, the people who would have been in a position to know whether the tomb was actually empty and whether they had actually seen Jesus alive. These were not people dying for a second-hand account. These were people dying for something they claimed to have personally witnessed. Peter was traditionally crucified upside down in Rome. James, the son of Zebedee, was executed by Herod Agrippa, as recorded in Acts 12 of the New Testament, the earliest account of a disciple's martyrdom. Paul of Tarsus, who by his own account in his letter to the Galatians had been Christianity's most vigorous persecutor, before a sudden and complete reversal, died in Rome under Nero. The conversion of Paul is itself one of the stranger data points in this entire story. He was not a credulous individual. He was educated, having studied under Gamaliel in Jerusalem according to Acts 22. He was motivated. He had actively participated in the persecution of the early church, including, by his own admission in the first chapter of Galatians, trying to destroy it. Whatever he encountered on the road to Damascus, as described in Acts 9 and confirmed by his own first-person account in 1 Corinthians 15, was sufficient to reverse the entire trajectory of his life. He gave up status, safety, and ultimately his life for a belief he had previously considered a dangerous heresy. The skeptical explanation that Paul had a psychological breakdown is possible, but requires ignoring the specificity and the coherence of what Paul himself wrote about the experience, in letters that are among the earliest documents in the entire New Testament and are dated by virtually all scholars to within 20 years of the crucifixion. Empires collapsed. The movement survived. This is the seventh mystery, and in some ways the most straightforwardly historical. You do not need to accept any supernatural claim to acknowledge that the survival and spread of Christianity constitutes a historical anomaly that demands explanation. The conventional explanations, psychological need, social utility, political manipulation, are all available, and none of them, singly or together, fully accounts for the specific pattern of what happened. A movement that should have died in its first week survived 3 centuries of systematic imperial suppression and emerged on the other side stronger than when the suppression began. Antony Flew did not become an evangelical Christian. This matters, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. He never accepted the authority of the Bible as divine revelation. He never joined a church. He remained, to the end of his life, deeply skeptical of organized religion and of claims about God's personal intervention in human affairs. What he moved toward was deism, the belief in a God of infinite intelligence who created a universe of extraordinary complexity and order, the kind of God that Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin had in mind when they spoke of nature's God, a being whose existence is inferred from the structure of the world rather than from personal relationship or revealed scripture. In There Is a God, Flew wrote that he was now open to the possibility of a divine revelation, and that of all the religious traditions he had examined, the Christian claim about Jesus deserved the most serious engagement. He noted that N.T. Wright had made a solid case for the historicity of the resurrection, which was remarkable from a man who had spent 30 years arguing against precisely that kind of claim. He ended the book without a conversion narrative, without a prayer, without an altar call. He ended it with a philosopher's conclusion, that the evidence, weighed honestly, had shifted the balance toward theism, and that he was now prepared to follow the evidence to that destination. This is what makes his story genuinely strange and genuinely important. It is not a story about a weak man finding comfort. It is not a story about religious propaganda converting a vulnerable person. It is a story about one of the 20th century's most rigorous philosophical minds encountering 7 mysteries, in the DNA of a single cell, in the fine-tuned constants of the universe, in the non-Christian testimony of Roman historians, in the historical anomaly of the resurrection, in ancient prophecies confirmed as pre-Christian by physical evidence, in the unsolvable puzzle of why matter is conscious at all, and in the survival of a movement that had every reason not to survive, and concluding, after a lifetime of honest investigation, that the simplest explanation was the one he had resisted the longest. The man who spent his life arguing against God reached an unexpected conclusion. Not because the arguments against God stopped being interesting, not because the challenges to faith disappeared, not because the hard questions got easier. The hard questions remained hard. The suffering in the world remained unexplained. The diversity of religious claims remained confusing. The gap between the God of the philosophers and the God of Abraham remained wide. But the evidence, the cold, structural, historical, molecular, philosophical evidence, began pointing somewhere. And Flew was, above all else, a man who had promised to follow the evidence wherever it led. The DNA inside a single cell encodes more information than a library. The universe is calibrated to a precision that defies chance. Historians hostile to Christianity confirmed that its founder was real and was executed. Scholars working from within purely historical methodology cannot fully account for why the tomb was empty or why the disciples died for what they claim to have seen. Ancient texts that predate Jesus by a century describe a figure whose biographical resemblance to Jesus is, at minimum, extraordinary. The most sophisticated philosophy of mind of the last 100 years cannot explain why matter experiences itself. And a movement that faced the full weight of the Roman Empire not only failed to be destroyed, but absorbed the empire itself. What happens when the evidence begins pointing somewhere you never wanted to go? Flew spent 50 years building walls against that question. In the end, the philosopher in him was stronger than the atheist. He followed the evidence, and the evidence led him to the edge of something he could not, with intellectual honesty, continue to deny. Perhaps the greatest mystery was not the Bible itself. Perhaps it was why one of atheism's most brilliant and most committed voices spent a lifetime trying to look away, and what it finally cost him to stop. Literary and scholarly references for this script: Antony Flew with Roy Varghese, There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind, Harper 1, 2007. The primary source for Flew's reasoning, including his DNA argument, Chapter 6, pp. 74-88, and his engagement with the resurrection, Chapter 9, pp. 155-186. Antony Flew, God and Philosophy, Hutchinson 1966. Reprinted by Prometheus Books 2005. The foundational text of Flew's Atheism, laying out the logical positivist challenge to theism, Antony Flew, Theology and Falsification, originally published in University, 1950-51, reprinted in New Essays in Philosophical Theology, edited by Flew and McIntyre, SCM Press 1955, pp 96-99, N.T. Wright, The Resurrection of the Son of God, T.N.T. Clark, 2003. Particularly Part 1, Chapters 12-18, for the historical argument about the mutation of Jewish resurrection belief. Wright's engagement with the empty tomb is in Chapter 17. Gary Habermas and Michael Licona, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. Kriegel, 2004. The minimal facts argument is laid out in Part 1, pp. 44-77. The chapter on Paul's conversion is pp. 64-69. Gary Habermas, On the Resurrection, Volume 1, Evidences, B&H Academic, 2024. The culmination of 50 years of research on the historical probability of the resurrection, David Chalmers. The Conscious Mind, In Search of a Fundamental Theory, Oxford University Press, 1996. The hard problem is introduced in Chapter 1. The philosophical zombie argument is developed in Chapter 3, pp. by 93-122. David Chalmers, Facing Up to the Problem of Consciousness. Journal of Consciousness Studies 2-3, 1995, pp. 200-219. The original paper coining the term, Alvin Plantinga. Where the Conflict Really Lies, Science, Religion, and Naturalism. Oxford University Press, 2011. The argument against the self-defeating character of naturalism is in Part 4, Chapter 10. Fred Hoyle, The Universe, Past and Present Reflections, Engineering and Science, 45, November 1981, pp. 8-12. Source of the Monkeyed with Physics, quote, Fred Hoyle, The Intelligent Universe, Michael Joseph, 1983. The list of anthropic properties is discussed in Chapter 9. Paul Davies, The Mind of God, The Scientific Basis for a Rational World, Simon & Schuster, 1992. The fine-tuning argument and its implications are in Chapters 5 and 8. Gerald Schroeder, The Science of God, The Convergence of Scientific and Biblical Wisdom, Broadway Books, 1997. Cited by Flew in There Is a God for its probabilistic arguments on the origin of life. Tacitus. Annals Book 15, Chapter 44, written c. 116 AD. Available in the Loeb Classical Library Edition, translated by John Jackson, Harvard University Press, 1937, Flavius Josephus. Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, 63-64, Testimonium Flavianum, and Book 20, 9, 1, reference to James. Written c. 93-94 AD, Loeb Classical Library Edition, translated by Louis Feldman, Pliny the Younger. Epistles, Book 10, Letters 96 and 97. Written c. 112 AD, Loeb Classical Library Edition, translated by Betty Radice. The Great Isaiah Scroll, 1Q Isaiah. Discovered 1947, Qumran Cave 1. Dated c. 150-100 BC. Full digital text and images available at the Israel Museum Digital Dead Sea Scrolls Project, https://dss.collections.imj.org.el, Isaiah 53, Hebrew Bible, the Masoretic text. For the scholarly debate on interpretation, see John Goldingay and David Payne, A Critical and Exegetical Commentary on Isaiah 40-55, ICC Series, T&T Clark, 2006, Volume 2, pp. 290-320. Psalm 22, Hebrew Bible. For the historical and literary context, see Peter Craigie, Psalms 1-50. Word Biblical Commentary, Thomas Nelson, 1983, pp. 195-207. Peter Gentry and Stephen Wellham, Kingdom Through Covenant. Crossway, 2012. Chapter 13 addresses messianic interpretation of Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22 within their canonical context. Richard Dawkins, The Blind Watchmaker. Norton, 1986. The Primary Atheist Counter-Argument to the Design Inference. Richard Dawkins, The Selfish Gene. Oxford University Press, 1976. the gene-level selection model that Flew directly engages in. There is a God.